everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm Mindy Mitchell, Director for Individual Homeless Adults here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. First of all, let me apologize for the confusion about the timing of this webinar. The date was changed a while back due to a scheduling conflict, and the webinar platform was supposed to send an update to all registrants, but I believe that that notice did not go out to everyone. I also have a couple of housekeeping tips about the webinar today. First of all the participants will be muted except for speakers and panelists during their presentations. But at any time during the webinar, you should enter questions for the speakers into the question box that you see on the right of your screen. We will be gathering those questions throughout the webinar, and our panelists will answer as many of those as they can at the end of all the presentations. Additionally, the webinar and the slides will be made available after the broadcast. So joining us today, we're going to have two great panelists from the state of Connecticut who work together to help implement Connecticut's coordinated entry system for youth and to make youth rapid rehousing a vital piece of that whole process. First, I'm going to be providing us with an overview of coordinated entry generally. Then we'll hear from Caitlin Rose, Special Project Manager at New Reach Incorporated in New Haven, Connecticut. Caitlin's going to tell us all about the development and implementation of Connecticut's Youth Coordinated Entry System. Next, we'll have longtime Rapid Rehousing for Youth Learning Community member John Lawler. He's the Director of Homeless Youth and Young Adult Programs at The Connection in Hartford, Connecticut. John's going to talk about the Connection's Youth Rapid Rehousing Program, including how it's connected with the Coordinated Entry System. So after we get this picture of one community's coordinated entry system from kind of one end to the other, we'll open up the conversation for your questions. Again, you can submit your questions at any time in the box on the right of your screen. And finally, I'll let you know a little bit about what we have coming up this year for the learning community. So to get us started, as usual, we have our reminder about what we're talking about when we say rapid rehousing. It's a housing first, permanent housing intervention that helps people find housing, pay for that housing, and maintain that housing through voluntary case management services that connect people to the resources that they need in the community to achieve stability. And of course, the really exciting and eventually depressing data that I shared last December on why we are focusing on rapid rehousing is that thanks to the advocacy of innovative rapid rehousing for youth providers and young people themselves, communities around the country have greatly increased their youth rapid rehousing programs. So these are the total HUD McKinney-Vento Awards for youth-specific rapid rehousing programs in the past few years. And this actually isn't including any of the funding that has now gone out for the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, or YHDP. And of course, we know that many more young people are being served with COC and ESG funding that is not population specific. So the amount of McKinney-Vento rapid rehousing funding going to young people is actually much higher than what we see here. These numbers also don't include rapid rehousing funding from other systems like TANF, which serves many young parents who are experiencing homelessness, and also does not include funding from the Veterans Administration, which has SSVF rapid rehousing, and that does serve a small number of young veterans. But this other chart provides the best reason for why we want to talk about youth rapid rehousing. It's from the most recent AHAR, and we know that at least half of the young people experiencing homelessness on a single night were unsheltered. And we know that increasing permanent housing options is one of the important ways that we can increase the flow of young people out of homelessness. So as we start to think about why Rapid Rehousing for Youth Learning Community members said they were ready to start exploring more systemic responses to homelessness in this year's learning community, we can revisit these lessons learned from past years, especially this one at the bottom, because rapid rehousing is not just a housing model, it's part of a systemic response to homelessness. So what do we mean by a system anyway? A system brings together many interdependent parts. They aren't all doing the same thing. They have different roles, different responsibilities. And in an effective system, all of these parts are working together within a defined set of practices. So the system knows where the boundaries are, it knows the resources that it has to work with, and it knows the primary methods and practices that should be used. And all of those things are aligned and working together towards a common goal. In our case, the common goal is to house young people who are experiencing homelessness and to house them quickly. So the goal of an effective homelessness response system is that all components align with the other components so that all the interventions are working towards that goal. So in an effective system, we've not only designed all our programs and models around that goal, but the whole system, our whole community's resources and programs align their roles and their activities around that central goal of getting young people back into housing as quickly as possible. We've seen that the communities with the best results have this intense focus on housing young people as quickly as possible through the housing first approach, which is helping a homeless young person move into housing and then providing all the other help that that young person decides that they need once they're housed. So if we want to understand kind of why everyone's talking about taking this systemic approach to homelessness, we have to think about how we used to do things. Kind of the way that we have as a nation approached homelessness and in our communities for a very long time was through siloed individual programs that were working on their own to kind of manage the problem of homelessness and to serve the lucky few folks who happen to get into their programs. And none of the programs and communities were coordinated with each other. They were just focused on, understandably, meeting the needs of the people who were right in front of them. But a systemic approach to homelessness is different. The aim is to end homelessness. It focuses on significantly reducing the number of people experiencing homelessness throughout the community and improve that community level performance on homelessness. It uses our scarce resources more efficiently and improves the flow of folks out of homelessness and back into permanent housing. Developing a coordinated entry system is one of the really important parts of making that switch to a systemic approach to ending homelessness. Now, I think probably for a lot of us, we've gone through this process of putting on paper that we have a coordinated entry system. But if after your community has engaged in creating a coordinated system, your system still looks the same as it did before, except you added an assessment tool, you haven't really switched to a systemic response to homelessness. All of these pieces are part of an effective coordinated entry system. Coordinated entry helps us move from that silo, program-centered approach to a collective impact approach that centers our clients and the community as a whole. So here you can see, thanks to Napa County for letting the Alliance use the visual of what their coordinated entry system looked like before. This probably looks familiar to a lot of folks. And here's the visualization of what Napa's coordinated entry system looks like now after they redesigned the entire system kind of through this systems lens. Coordinated entry has some specific goals that we should all be keeping in mind as we're designing it in our communities. It's consistent, it's streamlined, it's transparent to people experiencing homelessness, and they're able to access services and housing, very focused on housing. It centers the client. It ensures that people who have the highest need and who are the most vulnerable, especially those who are unsafe and outside, are prioritized for services and housing, and helps to try to make the access to services and housing more fair and equal. It also really uses data to make sure that the system is being used in the most effective way and to help with planning and reallocation and utilization for future allocation. And most importantly, it strives for making the match to permanent housing rapid. Strives being the key word there. Of course, this is probably how coordinated entry feels for many of us right now. But we have to remember that coordinated entry is simply revealing the messiness that was always there for people experiencing homelessness. So to go back, this was the experience for people who were experiencing homelessness. It was all over the map, and whether or not you got help depended on where you happened to be lucky enough to end up. And change is difficult, of course, but shifting to the systemic approach rooted in coordinated entry is an attempt in our communities to put the client at the center of a more fair, rational, and intentional process to house people as quickly as possible with the best available interventions. So now we'll hear from one of the communities, and by community in this case, we're talking about a whole state, but it's a fairly small one. Connecticut has really been leading systems change to end-use homelessness. So first up, we have Caitlin Rose. Caitlin, please tell us about what Connecticut has done to remove itself from this firestorm and implement a youth coordinated entry system.
Hi, thank you so much, Mindy. My name is Caitlin Rose. I am the Special Projects Program Manager at New Reach. New Reach is a nonprofit in Greater New Haven and Fairfield counties in Southern Connecticut, and I'm very excited to tell you a little bit about what we as a state, and in specifically my communities, we've been doing to prevent and end homelessness through coordinated entry. Next slide. So some of what we're going to be talking about here today is a very high-level overview of coordinated entry in Connecticut and how we've tweaked coordinated entry in Connecticut to best serve young people. We're going to talk a little bit about an initiative that we've piloted statewide called the YETI, what the role of diversion means when we're discussing coordinated entry, and how youth move through our housing continuum if they are deemed eligible. And I do just want to kind of highlight very quickly that when we're talking about youth right now, we're talking about youth 18 to 24. Our state is working to address the needs of minors through our coordinated entry system, but we're kind of tweaking that still. And so I'm really speaking specifically about youth 18 to 24. I just want to clarify that off the bat. So in the state of Connecticut, we have 8 regions designated as CANs. CAN stands for Coordinated Access Network. We use the term coordinated access and coordinated entry interchangeably. It is a way for our regions to work together to ensure that there's no wrong way to access services, just like Mindy mentioned. For our coordinated access networks, there are designated towns that are all kind of in a geographical area that are kind of mandated to work together and kind of pool our resources so that the front door system is very specified for the citizens that live within those towns. And we have a continuum of responses to homelessness, which I'll show in just a moment, focusing on diversion and prevention whenever possible, and then really gearing up in response based on individualized case planning and what the individual in front of us needs. We're really looking to expand the inclusion of progressive engagement in that. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but that is something that we embrace here in Connecticut. And our CANs really are beyond just homeless service providers. We work very closely with our mental health providers, healthcare providers, government entities, education systems, and specifically with youth, our community agencies that are serving at-risk populations. It's not just the homeless response system that are engaged in the CAN. Next slide. So this is a very high-level view of how we demonstrate the flow of our coordinated access network. You'll see that this slide is not tailored specifically to youth. On the far left, you'll see that households in need of housing have a direct arrow to 211. That blue box below is to really encompass a little bit of how we've tailored our system to serve young people. Absolutely, we direct people to call 211. But we also really try to mitigate that barrier of a young person picking up the phone, sitting on hold, and being asked personal questions by a phone operator. So we do accept youth drop-in center walk-ins to be able to sit down with young people, find out what's happening with them, and assess if they do need a CAN assessment. We call 211 with them. And we really try to incorporate those community programs to know about 211 and what that process of calling 211 looks like so that they can be informed community partners and making sure youth are getting into the system. The 211 call is really focused on trying to divert a young person from homelessness. If we're not able to identify on that 211 call a safe place for a youth to go, we will schedule a CAN appointment, and we really try to keep that turnaround for a CAN appointment same day or next day. And we try to really have an open window of a youth attending a CAN appointment. We honor really the category 2 definition of homelessness is somebody's going to be homeless within 14 days. But again, because we can have youth walking into drop-in centers to receive support, we really want to be as proactive as we can to have a CAN appointment. The CAN appointment is a meeting with a designated CAN staff to discuss housing and resources. In Connecticut, with our YHDP funding, we have implemented in every CAN youth-specific navigators, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But those youth navigators actually conduct the CAN assessments and sit down to divert whenever possible, and if a youth is not able to be diverted, enter them into housing as quickly as possible. And you'll see that diversion is the arrow upwards. We try to divert at really every possible intervention. And if we're not able to divert, we will enter someone quickly into shelter if at all possible. Even if someone is in shelter, you'll see the below green box for self-resolved or rapid exit. We're continually trying to find an exit point along the way without relying on there being a straight shot to resources if there's any way that we can salvage community support. Next slide. So like I said, each CAN has youth-specific sites staffed with what we call youth navigators that work specifically with young adults with extensive training in adolescent brain development and trauma, how to address trauma symptoms. And each CAN appointment includes an assessment of a client's resources and inventory of their supports through a strengths-based, trauma-informed approach. And I think that's really important to emphasize. When we're talking about diversion, we want to divert away from the homeless response system when it's appropriate. And that really looks like talking about resources of support, maybe even calling those resources of support, and coming up with short and long-term housing plans. If a youth is in crisis, obviously, this may look different. This is a case-by-case conversation, and it really stems from what the youth is presenting with. But even if the youth can't be diverted from shelter and they do end up entering, we want to be connecting them to resources as soon as possible. And there is an attachment as a handout here for the coordinated entry toolkit. I'm not going to go through it here today, although I would be happy to answer any questions on it, but that is attached as a handout that you can find on the presentation slide here on the side. Next slide, Mindy. So how is coordinated entry for youth different than other populations? So in Connecticut, we really wanted to recognize that our coordinated entry system at large is really predicated upon self-referral. And when we're talking about working with young people, the community at large is a huge part of not only information sharing, but also community case planning and awareness building to get youth into the system whatever way they need. We really want to make sure that everyone in the community not only knows how to recognize signs of youth homelessness, but they just feel at the very bare minimum comfortable to discuss a housing crisis with youth and feel like they're equipped with the tools to know what to do. And that's something that we've been really undertaking through our youth engagement team initiative, which stands for YETI, which every CAN has. So I'm going to move into talking a little bit about what the YETIs are. Next slide. So what is a YETI? Beyond an acronym, it's a collaborative, really, at its most basic, a collaborative of people concerned about youth homelessness. So the YETI is in every region, and it's an offshoot of the Coordinated Access Network. So it's a completely integrated part of the CAN. It really is a byproduct of our YHDP award. This was a part of our community planning. And it's an embodiment of the best practice that resolving youth homelessness is a team effort. We know that youth try a variety of other options before they ask for help, and we want to intervene early and mitigate the number of youth experiencing literal homelessness. The YETI, in its most basic form, is really an attempt at prevention whenever possible for youth homelessness. Next slide. So who specifically are a part of the YETI? In my community, it really looks like young adult service providers, the homeless response system at large, whether it's youth or general pops, housing providers, government entities such as DCF, Department of Mental Health. We have people from the education system, so from the public education department for high schools. We do have some college and university providers. Street outreach department is obviously a wildly important part of this work, using young adults with lived experience, and then really anyone in the community connected to and passionate about resolving youth homelessness. We've had some participation from a variety of different community partners that just feel like in their everyday work, every now and again, they find a youth who's struggling with housing, and they really want to understand what the solution is and what's being worked on and how they can be a part of it. Next slide. And what the YETI does, and it looks like this got cut off a little bit, so I'll read each of these. But what we do is we review our coordinated access network data on regarding youth on our shelter wait list, our by name list, and the housing placement. So there is a way that we're actually looking at data to really inform, do we need to make adjustments in our system? And the answer is yes, which takes us to our next point on the top right. We are creating policies and procedures for the CAN to integrate youth housing services, and the youth definition of homelessness into the existing CAN system. The definition of homelessness for youth is different than adults, and we really want to make sure that we're honoring the different eligibility criteria and how we can work with youth to categorize them and quickly link them to services and make sure everyone in the CAN is involved in that. We troubleshoot regional issues to operationalize and troubleshoot processes. We really act as kind of a community where people know people. So if there is a snag in the system in any way, somebody that's in the community doesn't feel siloed by that. They know that they can call me as the YETI lead or one of the other housing providers, and that we're all going to work together to figure out what the issue is and what the barrier is to help the young person in need. We're also continually reviewing who needs to be a part of the YETI, who needs to come in to these discussions. The YETI has been around for a little over 2 years, but it's a work in progress. And informs the local execution of projects and initiatives. So the YETI oversees the annual point in time count, which I'm sure most communities participate in. Right now we're undergoing a 100-day challenge event, and the YETI is really the backbone of that. And the last one is prevent and end youth homelessness by 2020 per federal goals. That's really our underlying goal with the YETI, is to work really on behalf of the CAN as a youth specialization group to prevent and end youth homelessness. Next slide. So how does the YETI support coordinated entry? So as I said, the YETI is really a preventative action to keep someone from entering the homeless system at large as much as possible. We know one of the things we've seen in our community is that there's a very blurry line between prevention and diversion. For a while, the messaging has been contact 211, and 211 will schedule you a CAN assessment. And there's actually a lot of things that the community can do, particularly with youth experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, that might actually mitigate their need for a CAN appointment, or at least just take some of the urgency and crisis out of the situation. So we've really been gearing up our work with the YETI around the preventative piece. So working with schools and community agencies on our identification of homeless young people, and working with them to create solutions to prevent homelessness down the road. So really working with McKinney Vento liaisons and the like. Diversion, we really define pretty loosely. It's any activity that prevents somebody from needing to enter shelter. So that might include financial resources, which we have been working to develop. We have some through our YHDP grant, and then some other pots of funding that we can use to quickly rehouse somebody outside of the needing to enter emergency shelter. But diversion typically looks at what community resources there are, what sort of conflict mediation and education about the homeless system do we need to have. Sometimes that's letting community partners know about really what does the homeless response system mean? What does that mean for youth to enter shelter? What is entering shelter like? And also we embrace in Connecticut stride mediation training, which came out of Southern California. And so training our community partners in stride mediation training to be able to help intervene in a little bit more intensive way than some Arcan staff are able to. And as I say, that really almost always looks like we're working with community partners. So I wanted to share, this is a flyer that we created through CCH that we've been distributing throughout our YETI participants and other community agencies, just walking through staff on how to help youth in a housing crisis. And you'll notice that it has really the basics: create a safe space, actively listen, ask clarifying questions to understand, help develop a plan. And you'll notice that number 5 is call 211. And that's not to turn folks away from 211 or to mitigate what the benefit is of having coordinated entry through 211. We're really just trying to emphasize that we know for young people, they're gonna wanna talk to somebody that's right in front of them. And if they're taking the step to disclose to a staff member that they're struggling with housing, we want that staff member, no matter where they're working, to feel really comfortable to hunker down and get into the housing crisis with them. And the YETI will always be available to provide resources or support. And so that's part of some of the community awareness and sharing. People call me in the community all the time to ask about resources, and I'm happy to provide that information. But we really want to empower, again, a community at large to really take a second and work with the young people that are disclosing their homelessness as much as possible. If there's any way to mitigate the trauma of hitting the streets or needing to enter shelter, then we certainly want to be able to do that. And one thing I will note about calling 211 is we really encourage that community provider, if somebody has sat down with the youth and really worked on some of this, the youth navigators, we want to hear from them. We want to hear what community supports there are and what actions have already been tried, because that really saves the youth navigators a lot of time from needing to duplicate efforts and really be able to step in, see if there are some fresh ideas that they have as kind of the professionals in this work, but to really kind of expedite that process of moving a young person into shelter if at all needed. Next slide. So I've been hinting at this conversation about youth navigators. Youth navigators are funded positions through YHDP. They were unfunded previously in some communities. New Haven specifically had youth navigators to kind of pilot what this work would look like. And youth navigators conduct young adult CAN appointments and provide light touch case management to secure safe housing options for youth outside of the homeless response system, if at all possible. So they're really doing that diversion work, sometimes referring back to the community for some prevention work. And if diversion is not possible, they really want to enroll a youth directly into a shelter bed that day. There are times where youth come to CAN appointments and they don't want to enter shelter, or the shelter that's available might be an all ages setting and they're not comfortable going there. And those youth navigators are going to be working with that young person to kind of follow them through the system. They have a personalized contact, they just share direct information, and they really act as kind of a mentor through the homeless response system and make sure that they don't get lost. We also, because our CAN appointments can be scheduled when a youth is imminently homeless within 14 days, we don't enroll young people into shelter beds if they're imminently homeless. We really try to work a diversion plan with them. And so it's very important that the youth navigators are in constant contact with that young person that maybe are just precariously housed, and it could go either way, because we do not want them to have to hit the street to be able to be eligible for shelter. We want to be able to try everything we can, and if it's not successful, really rapidly enroll them into a shelter bed. And youth navigators are also responsible for administering the next step tool when appropriate to ensure that youth have been added to our housing registry. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the next step tool. The next step tool is our assessment that we use as a state. There's one for families, there was one for individual adults, and the next step tool is the name for young people. And that is the yellow dotted line there, that if a youth receives the next step tool, they are put on our by name list. And our by name list is really our housing registry. Every CAN has their own by name list. It's not statewide. So it's a smaller kind of subsection per CAN, and it's all the youth that are literally homeless, either on the streets or in shelter, or are Category 4, are fleeing domestic violence, or actively engaged in some sort of unsafe behavior that will lead for them to be literally homeless without assistance. And so being on the by name list in basic terms means that you have no other resource to stabilize yourself without long-term assistance from the homelessness response system. All of our housing programs really at this point go through the coordinated access network. And so any housing you'll see on the far right side, rapid rehousing, supportive housing, all of that goes through the CAN. And they're prioritized through our housing case conferences, which John's going to talk about in a moment. Next slide. So it's a little bit hard to see, but I have our guidance of when do they administer the next step tool. The next step tool is a couple of questions that really rank vulnerabilities. We try to wait to administer the next step tool once a youth is in shelter if possible, but we absolutely will conduct the next step tool if someone comes to a CAN appointment and they've been literally homeless. There's pros and cons on when you administer the next step tool. I mean, it is a pretty vulnerable assessment, and so it is best to give with a young person if you have a rapport build. I mean, there's some comfortability, but we do use that as our way to track the need for long-term housing intervention. So we do not conduct the next step tool with individuals that we're trying to divert from a homeless response system, because we would not put them on our housing registry. Next slide. So our challenges with coordinated entry for youth. So I think the community, we're really working very hard with our communities to build awareness and build prevention up. But prevention is swimming upstream, and it takes a while to get communities on board and have them really know and understand what youth at risk of homelessness is. And there's different understandings of HUD categories within the community and what it really means to be Category 2 and imminently homeless versus at risk. It's really hard to keep tabs on youth if we're not enrolling a youth directly into shelter, or if a youth does not want to enter shelter but wants to engage. They often lose phones. If there's not immediacy, they might self-resolve and come back. So we really had to tailor, what our process is for keeping youth on a shelter wait list or on our by name list, our housing registry, so that we're not closing people out prematurely, and that we're really kind of connecting with youth and keeping that thread of contact. The next step tool endorses risk factors, but it relies on youth reports. So we've seen a lot of youth scoring really low that actually have really high vulnerabilities. Because they're underreporting their own symptoms. And then also youth that score really high, but may have symptoms that if they were housed, those symptoms might actually very quickly resolve, because it tends to count for the same point average, really high risk factors, and then just, basic things like have you sought medical care? And again, they're sensitive questions, and your answers might vary depending on who is asking and when. And so we're still trying to figure out when to best use this assessment so that we're able to get the best information and use that for prioritization. And we don't have a perfect prioritization just yet. On that note, I will pass it off to my colleague, John, to pick up where I'm leaving off with prioritization and housing matching.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. So hi, everyone. My name is John Lawler. I'm the Director of Homeless Youth and Young Adult Programs at The Connection. I've run a youth-specific rapid rehousing program for close to about 7 years now, which means basically I haven't slept in a decade or so. And I'll be going into kind of some of the back-end aspects of the coordinated entry, essentially from that yellow dotted line that Caitlin had showed, from once you get on the by name list through to completion. So at The Connection, we run 2 youth-specific rapid rehousing programs. The one that's better known, and I presented on here before, is called the START program. I've listed some of our data, and we do have a third-party evaluation that's about midway through. So we're hoping to have a publication out sometime in the next year. But our newer project, which is YHDP funded, is the Rapid Rehousing for Emerging Adults program. And so we've certainly been modifying that and closely collaborating so that way it lines up well with the youth-specific coordinated access plan that we have here in Connecticut. If you can hit the next slide. Okay, so once a youth gets on a by name list, it's not necessarily that they're just sitting, going nowhere and not doing anything. What Connecticut put in place through YHTP funding was the Youth Navigator role, and their role is really to be able to track and follow this youth, not the way that NSA does through your phones or anything like that. But really, we have to see who is naturally self-resolving so we can take them off that by name list. And which youth would be able to resolve if they just had a very light touch of resource through the system. So sometimes that might be a security deposit or some other type of financial assistance to be able to get them to exit homelessness or exit a shelter pretty quickly. And likewise, as Caitlin mentioned, there is Strive mediation services that's available. So really trying to work with some of those natural supports, family members, to help them exit to a permanent housing destination that's kind of outside of the system. A lot of linkages to employment, vocational services, and other buckets of housing services that youth can fall into, DCF reentry services, or programs that can provide housing along with education, such as Job Corps. Really trying to work with those youth to see who's eligible, who's interested, so that way we can kind of take some of the pressure off the rapid rehousing census, the volume. And of course, one of my favorite parts is that they are working on a lot of the document readiness with them while they're on the by name list. Next slide. Okay, so for those youth that aren't able to self-resolve or can't access or just aren't appropriate for rapid exit funding, et cetera, youth prioritization for housing resources, especially for rapid rehousing in Connecticut. First priority is youth that are experiencing chronic homelessness. So that's not too many of what we see on our by name list here in Connecticut, but we do have it here and there. Second priority is just the bulk of who we see, youth experiencing homelessness in Connecticut. They've gone through that entire early part of the system and they're still homeless. And then third priority is youth who are in transitional housing. Now, Mindy, if you can just click briefly. Within these categories, everyone is essentially prioritized by their next step tool score, and that's kind of the general rule of thumb that we in Connecticut try to follow and hold ourselves to. Mindy, would you mind clicking over? Thank you. So after they get on the by name list, they're not self-resolving. For a rapid rehousing provider, the vehicle that you get referrals through is what's called a matching meeting, and they have matching meetings in the adult system as well, the family system. We do have a separate youth matching meeting. And what that is we essentially meet twice a week, and it consists of shelter providers who might have youth in their shelters, rapid rehousing providers, obviously, youth navigators, and outreach staff if they have contact with youth. And the whole point of that meeting is to really review the current by name list and determine which youth should get the next available slot of a service like rapid rehousing or PSH if it's available. Next slide. So again, we're primarily prioritized based on the next step tool score, but with that said, we do have built in some flexibility. We understand that the next step tool score is meant to help determine who should get the next available resource. But there are other factors that do come into play. Youth who are starting to amass time as being homeless and are at risk of chronic homelessness, or youth who are in consistently in very dangerous circumstances, living environments as well. So while it's a rule that we follow, we pretty much do go from the top down when it's sorted by the score. Part of the purpose of this matching meeting is to find ways or find circumstances where it's more appropriate to break that rule to fill that particular rapid rehousing slot. A large context of what these matching meetings are, though, are just those providers who are currently working with youth, especially the youth navigators, just for updates, some of the plans that they're working on, trying to identify those that might be able to self-resolve in the near future, so that way we don't necessarily just take them on in a rapid rehousing program. And the benefit for the rapid rehousing provider being part of that meeting is that we already have a good sense of the history of what's been done, what's been tried, what didn't work, what showed some promise here and there, and we have that information long before they're ever assigned to us. What doesn't usually occur at these meetings, because I know it can be a concern in some communities, is just the conversation of trying to determine if a youth is a good fit for rapid rehousing. And the reason being, with our particular state, we don't necessarily have youth-specific PSH reserves, so we really are trying to use this level to be able to test youth out and see what they're able to do. Again, running the program that I've been running for 7 years, I've never come across a youth that I felt was a good fit for rapid rehousing. But with that said, give them a little stability and try to work with them, help them figure out. And they are overwhelmingly successful in this type of care. It's just up front, it looks pretty daunting. And again, with the youth navigators being able to work with them so diligently, this is the meeting where we're able to take a lot of youth off of the by name list as they self-resolve. So really just being able to keep tabs on the youth that are on there, so that way it doesn't grow out of control with people who actually self-resolved a long time ago, which is another huge benefit for it. Next slide, please. And so, okay, we have a youth that does finally get matched to rapid rehousing. So where we go from there is, at that point, the rapid rehousing provider already has a good amount of history on the young person. The only paperwork that we're really trying to do with them is just the HUD required stuff that we have to do as a rapid rehousing provider. But we also do with some kind of standardized self-assessments to have the youth take a look at what aspects of their life they want to try to set goals for that are going to help them permanently stabilize their housing in a pretty quick manner. And then right from the get-go, the housing search begins. Again, since we know a lot about these youth even before they're matched with us, and we can usually predict who's going to be matched with us on any given week, we can already start to feel out some of the potential landlords around certain barriers. So we'll be able to reach out to landlords in advance, knowing that, okay, the next 2 or 3 ones have pretty significant criminal histories that are going to show up on their record. What landlords do we have that we know are kind of record friendly? So another benefit of just being part of that coordinated entry system with that matching meeting and our presence there. And then if in the event that a youth starts to disengage with the rapid rehousing case manager pretty early on, we'll usually circle back with the youth navigator to see if they can help us reestablish contact and really try to get the engagement rolling. All right, next slide, please. And so some of the benefits that I've covered here, at least from the perspective of a rapid rehousing provider, is that you already know a lot of what's been going on there. You don't have to ask the same questions of this youth over and over again that they've hit multiple times throughout the system. There's a clear record for it, and it's a little bit less traumatizing that way. Homeless stop verifications, for the most part, already done. That's a very nice benefit. But more importantly, I think what we're finding, what we're planning, is that we get to use those youth navigators as a bit of a time machine in terms of the relationship with rapid rehousing providers. If you do currently provide rapid rehousing of any type, I'm sure you're kind of really not too excited about constantly getting people with zero income, because people with zero income, it might be tough to house, but they're going to have a really hard time affording their utilities. And of course, there's not a limitless supply of apartments that come with every utility included. So as we come across job openings, places that we know are hiring for individuals who have records, we can actually push that information down at the youth navigator level, so that way they start working with youth on it earlier. And so the net effect is that we'll see more youth who are employed coming into our program, just as a result of us being able to funnel information and start the intervention a little bit earlier in the system, instead of waiting for it to hit rapid rehousing. Another example that becomes helpful is shared housing. So what we know from our data here in Connecticut is that most youth that exit our rapid rehousing program usually have to go into some form of roommate living situation. So youth navigators being connected, and shelters too, being connected to so many of the homeless young people in the community, we just ask them and encourage the youth navigators to find ways, creative ways, to get them to meet, get them to pair up. And we know that that is going to be able to expand the capacity of how many we are serving if they choose to live together. And it's also probably going to decrease the amount of time that they'll need in our program with financial barriers, that discrepancy between cost of living and what they're going to make, often kind of elongating how long they might need the rapid rehousing program for. If you can hit the next slide. And some of the challenges, I'll give you, honestly, it's overwhelmingly good, but I mean, this scenario will seem pretty familiar, particularly in the Connecticut system where we're working on the highest next up tool scores down. It usually means that you might be taking on a lot of very high barrier youth very early on and all at once. So the other YHD communities might experience this depending on how the prioritization goes. Mindy, would you mind clicking real quick? But again, we know that for the most part, most of the youth are not going to appear to seem all too housing ready or like they're going to be especially able to afford their own apartment within 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. But again, through that progressive engagement framework and lack of options, they're certainly going to be better off in a rapid rehousing program than remaining homeless. Next slide, please. And the other challenges that do come up is that various agencies, various parties throughout this coordinated entry system have different benchmarks and different areas of focus. So coordinated entry staff, looking at the front end aspect of it, are really trying to get youth that are on the by name list into permanent housing in any form very, very quickly. On the tail end with rapid rehousing, our benchmarks are really to get them housed very quickly, but also get them off subsidy as quickly as possible, because we, through funders, we have our benchmarks to meet on that. And so sometimes that can create a little bit of a discord or disalignment when the pressure is on to just get them a roof over their head so quickly, when the roof over their head might not be sustainable for them in a reasonable time frame. So all of those things are still works in progress. The other challenges that come up with coordinated entry that we've hit recently is how to treat shared housing. So again, we have this housing prioritization system that's largely built upon chronicity or chronic homelessness, but also the next step tool score. And when you have two youth who are on a by name list that agree to live with another and give shared housing a shot, they're very rarely going to be the next two youth on their list. Maybe one of the youth is, and then the other one is towards the bottom of that list. So really just trying to get creative through the coordinated entry process and the systems and those matching meetings to come up with guidelines about how we treat that and how we move forward. And that is about all that I have to share with you. I know that we wanted to save time for questions. I did have to put in an obligatory cat meme for a meme that's actually a requirement of these webinars.
Yes.
And there's the contact information for both myself and Caitlin if there's any other questions or if people just want to cry to me about difficulties in working with youth. We're up for a good cry as well.
We in DC are always up for a good cry right now. For wholly different reasons. And thank you so much. My crazy cat lady plan for taking over the world is definitely starting to work. So thank y'all for thinking of me on that. I will say too, I added for both of you, when we were talking about different categories of HUD eligibility within the HUD definition of homelessness, I did add, for folks who aren't familiar with it, to the handouts, a HUD eligibility flowchart and appendix that explains the different categories. Couch surfing youth are included in the HUD definition of homelessness. There's just different levels of eligibility there. So I really like that Connecticut from the beginning has kind of worked that awareness into the whole coordinated entry process. And I will say to John, your meme and GIF game is getting really good, and you definitely could have used a good one in that not following youth in a creepy way.
They would all flag my internet tracking system. Yeah,
that was asking for a good GIF. And we do have, I think I screwed up, I had between 3 and 3:30 on the ending, so we have a little bit of time for questions, and I have some good ones here, and not to be too cat-centric. So I'm going to get to some of the really good questions that we've had submitted so far during your presentations. We'll continue to gather questions during the Q&A, so all of you who are listening, you can submit your questions on the box on the right. Okay, first question, and either one of you can answer this, I think, because you both kind of talked about issues of safety at various times about thinking about who gets into rapid rehousing and how coordinated entry assesses safety. So we had a question specifically about shelter options or housing options for victims of trafficking. And so can either of you, maybe Caitlin, if you want to start on like the front end process. So how are you, since category 4 youth who are unsafe, which includes victims of trafficking, how are you assessing for safety? And then where are young people who are deemed not to be safe, where are they going?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that's one of our areas of learning. We have a really excellent statewide partner, Love 146, who really is a huge feeder for us for youth that are unsafe. And we work in partnership with them. And so we sometimes can shortcut some of this information. If we're receiving a referral for them, we kind of know what's going on. We really have to kind of balance the fact that some youth that are unsafe do not want to enter shelter, but do want a housing resource. And so that's kind of the middle ground of where they can go on our by name list. We have to do the next step tool, and that can be a slightly painful process because of the vulnerability of some of the questions. But we certainly, for the most part, are taking youth's word for it. We definitely are still having conversations about what other options are there, what have you tried, you know, who do you talk to about your housing, who knows what's going on, and if we can fish out another even temporary support to mitigate the need for shelter on a temporary basis, we will. But I think that that's always a little bit of a struggle because there's so much vulnerability in whether or not somebody is safe or not, and it's really up to the youth's determination. So what we found is oftentimes youth that are in unsafe situations, they want help getting out, but shelter is not what they want. So, I mean, again, that's where we're going to try and do the next step tool and get them on the by name list and try to get them into another housing resource as soon as possible.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
and can you, go ahead, John.
Go ahead. No, I think Caitlin summarized it very well. I think part of the work of what the YETI has been able to do is really expand their community-based outreach. So that way there's more entities throughout the community that know to try to contact the 211 or the YETI. And so a lot of times we can find out about youth who are being trafficked through those individuals or those resources that also kind of help us gauge, okay, yes, this is not just them saying it, that they're being trafficked. There's other people in alignment and agreement as well.
Right. Can y'all remind me too, it's been a while since I looked through the whole toolkit. Again, for everyone listening, the toolkit for the coordinated entry for youth is in the handout box on the right side of your webinar. Caitlin, is there a sheet in there about asking safety questions for 211 operators? To try, I know it's always a difficult thing to try to determine whether folks fall into category 4 or not. Obviously, people who are fleeing domestic violence or who are like, yes, I'm actually fleeing a trafficker, but young people who are maybe trading sex for a place to stay are also eligible under category 4. And how do we figure that out?
Yeah, so that's a main part of our 211 entry call. They're really assessing, they're asking safety questions, they're asking kind of immediacy questions. Do you have a place to stay tonight? And so there are safety questions to try and kind of divert them into our domestic violence kind of arm of the system. We did not get into it in this presentation, but we have coordinated entry in conjunction with the domestic violence system. And so there's kind of a phone tree where if somebody is flagged as somebody who actually is fleeing domestic violence, they are kind of patched over to that system for an immediate response and phone call rather than the homeless response system. And we work very closely on what that means if somebody enters the domestic violence arm, if they are indeed homeless, and how we can work together. What we've seen with young people is they often do not want to go into a domestic violence shelter. There's sometimes restrictions of having your phones, and there's some barriers with that. And so that is usually a very client-led conversation. Sometimes it's not even disclosed at the 211 call, but it is disclosed in the Navigator appointment. Sometimes we don't know until, a couple of weeks afterwards when the Navigator has been working with them for a while and gets a little bit more of the story. But we can't mandate that. We certainly ask about it, and we try to be as sensitive when we ask as possible. But it's really, it's client choice. So if they choose not to go to the DV system, we're going to work with them on our end, certainly.
Great, thank you. Okay, John, we knew these kinds of questions were going to come up. Lots of folks are interested in finding out more about that hard work on the provider end, particularly about the first one I want you to talk about is the landlord engagement piece of it. We've had lots of questions about your work with landlords. How many landlords do you work with? Do you have a separate person that does landlord engagement? Someone asked specifically, you asked a question about having landlords who are criminal record friendly. How'd you find that out? What makes them criminal record friendly? Give us the down low on landlord engagement at the Connection.
Okay, yeah, always a popular subject. So I'm pretty fortunate at the Connection in that we have a wide array of programs all throughout the state. So we have a program that's similar to a supportive housing program, but specifically for individuals who are on parole. And so they have a network of landlords who they work with who are obviously, you know, not overly concerned about the record and are still willing to rent to them. We have made cold calls as part of our program and just been upfront with landlords as well. It's not usually information that we want, you know, coming out during a background check on a particular youth. We'd rather have it up there at front. And for the most part, I think the sales pitch is the same no matter what the barriers might be for the youth. It really is trying to sell the program, sell the fact that we're going to be in the home, probably at least weekly, but probably multiple times a week, given the time frame that we try to work with youth on. And also just knowing that for the most part, this is going to be a safer rental for them. I mean, there's income guidelines, you know, the rental calculation has some income protection. So if the youth doesn't have a job, they're not necessarily going to be responsible for a portion. But that our role is really to work with them and get them kind of into shape where they can become self-sufficient over a period of time. And that's support that most renters, that people who are looking to rent from them, don't necessarily have. So we are kind of that safety net, and we really do try to push that with landlords heavily. With that said, we do not have a designated role for kind of an apartment search specialist, a landlord engagement specialist. We've gone back and forth with the idea a few times, but in the end, for the most part, we do tend to put that on the backs of the case manager as well. Mm-hmm. But I certainly know of plenty of programs that do that very successfully. Typically, it's someone who knows the real estate business in and out and who can speak landlord very fluently, because it is its own language.
Are your different case managers coordinating with one another, like different landlords that they're connecting with? Or is it like, if there's one case manager that's really good and another that's not her strong suit, then how does that affect the young people?
Yeah, we'll try to specialize. For the most part, I think one of the questions is how many different landlords that we work with. And at our agency, it's well over 100 between all the different types of housing programs we have. Wow. So we have a good stock to pull from. But yeah, absolutely. There's some case managers who are just natural salespeople. And particularly if you know you're about to take a wave of new youth on and you're going to need a lot of apartments, that's the person who you really have them focus on making the landlord sales pitches in advance, because there's just some people who have that charisma about them. So being able to identify that in your staff pretty quickly helps a lot, and specialize when you need to.
Great, thank you. Okay, Caitlin, here's one for you. Actually, most of the questions that we've gotten, maybe both of you too can contribute to this, but lots of questions about the youth navigators. Everyone is super interested in that. So can you tell us a little bit more? I know that's being funded under YHDP now. What is that going to look like moving forward under COC renewal? How many youth navigators are you using per CAN? That's the first couple of questions. And then I have some more about youth navigators.
I mean, John and I are in larger regions. We have 2 youth navigators in each region that are kind of formally funded. I'm not sure about the plan after renewal. We just kind of started our YHDP funds, so I'm not sure what the plans are. I'd like to think that they would get absorbed into kind of paid CAN staffing. But I mean, I think we're also playing around with how many staff there need to be to do this navigation role. And every region is kind of tailoring what the region needs that role to do. So, I mean, I think some of it really is a part of the demonstration project. We're a couple of months in, this is how it's been going. And that might really grow and change over the next year or so.
Yeah, it sounds really exciting, especially the part you talked about, John, with that they're kind of playing this role of like the thing that you talked about with getting young people connected to employment while they're on the by name list. There's a lot that can be done while young people are waiting to get into housing.
Yeah, we actually try to do that right at their CAN intake appointments too. We started to have pretty closer working relationships with workforce development agencies as well, just to get that ball rolling. Because what we find is that while many youth are coming in with that primary complaint of homelessness, right on the heels of that is, yeah, I need a job.
Right. Yeah, and you know, one thing that we always say a lot, especially to people who ask that don't know anything about homelessness and just come up and say, well, like, why are people homeless? What's going on there? And it's like, it's really as simple as a mismatch between income and cost of housing, right? And you can work on both sides of that equation. And for young people particularly, getting them connected to the job market is a really good way to help in their homelessness. Okay, let's see. Another question, either one of you, I don't know who would have this. You talked about having funding for rapid exit and self-resolution. Is that coming from YHDP, or are there other community resources that you can use kind of for what those different things might look like? Caitlin, maybe talk about like what are all the different things that might be? What is the thing that the funding does to help somebody self-resolve quickly?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't really get into rapid exit. Rapid exit funding is kind of, you would use it in the same flexible way that you would with diversion. It just might mean that you're in shelter versus you're being diverted from shelter or diverted from the homeless system at large, whereas rapid exit is you're encompassed in the homeless system in some form or fashion and we're trying to get you out. So right now for the youth system, we have funding through YHDP for both diversion and rapid exit. There is some, that's HUD money. So there's some kind of federal restraints around that. In other populations, we just have kind of general flexible pots, some ESG money, and other just community raised funds. But specifically for youth right now in our communities, we're using YHDP funds via HUD.
Great, thank you. For either one of you, are young people able to access throughout this process the housing resources that are available from the quote-unquote adult programs? Are they only being allowed to access youth-specific resources?
Good question. The short answer is yes, they can absolutely access the adult system. Where it got a little complicated is that the adult system shifted towards a prioritization that's more based on length of time homelessness, recurrence of homelessness. So they're on essentially two different lists with very different prioritizations. But they are still eligible for adult rapid rehousing, adult PSH if that's available, certainly adult shelters as well. So we don't have that many youth-specific shelter beds in the state.
Great, thank you. And so how long are young people on the by name list once they get to that part of the coordinated entry process?
Well, the benchmark is 45 days. So in the dreamiest of worlds, 45 days or less. So I think it kind of depends. We definitely, now that we have YHDP rapid rehousing, we're moving people pretty quickly off. We're obviously going to see that flow once all of our slots are filled in our communities and there's still an inflow of young people on the BNL. That's why we're really, you know, we always emphasize that we aren't wanting to bring people into the system and then have them waiting for rapid rehousing. We want to really be dynamically talking about what are the changes in circumstances. You have a job now. If you want to look at a roommate situation, we can use rapid exit funds. We want to be kind of diversifying that. So the goal is 45 days. We definitely have, you know, different medians of time depending on what area in the state you are, but we certainly don't want people sitting around and waiting for our housing resource if at all possible.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I think there's the youth navigator position is a big piece of that too, which is really just trying to work with, catch those who actually are self-resolving without much system interventions. That way they can be deactivated off of the list, but also help those exit who just need that lighter touch.
Great, thank you. Okay, and we're a little bit over, but I'll go ahead and throw in one more question because we had quite a few about this. I think people heard you both mention Strive. Can one or both of you say a little bit more about Strive mediators, what that role is, how that's being funded, what system is that coming from? Because if I remember correctly, that's not from the homelessness system. And where in your coordinated entry process that happens.
Yeah, so I'll take it a little bit, John, and then you can jump in. STRIVE is an acronym. It stands for Support to Reunite, Involve, and Value Each Other. I'm reading from our website. It's a psychoeducational intervention for reunifying families and adolescents. It did come from a researcher out of UCLA. We've had a couple of trainings here in Connecticut. Different agencies pay for them, and then the idea is that to be STRIVE trained, you then have to do the STRIVE mediation model on a certain number of youth and their families to kind of get certified. We've really been wanting to beef that up. It's hard because that's really a prevention piece. It's a little bit of diversion, but that's really more than a youth navigator can really take on, or at least has been able to, given all of the other roles and responsibilities. So I think we're still trying to figure out where that lives in our system, but certainly on the more front end. I think in the dreamiest of worlds, but we've been talking about it in my community, is really making sure that somebody in the school system can maybe do this. At a school that tends to have higher rates of student dropout related to homelessness, but I think we're still, at least near me, we're still trying to really figure out where to integrate that, because it's a really great model. And really can impact our community in preventing homelessness and quickly resolving it. I don't know if you have anything to add, John.
Yeah, I mean, the model itself involves 5 to maybe 6 in-home sessions with a STRIVE mediator to go in there and meet with the youth and their family members, whoever they designate, and really just to try to build on communication skills and use that as the backbone. It really can be used at any point in the homeless system. We put it heavily up front, hoping that we can use it as a means of diversion and avoiding homelessness, along with the prevention aspects that Caitlin mentioned in schools, et cetera. But oddly enough, with our involvement, the Connections involvement in the system, we probably use it a little bit more on the rapid rehousing side, because once they're stably housed and that pressure is off to live with the family members, we'll start to see the symptoms from that youth that they might be interested in reconnecting with some of their adult supports as they start talking about them a little bit more. And it's the perfect time to do that. Now the pressure to that you'll have to live with them is completely off, so they can start to rebuild that as well.
Oh, that's really smart. Okay, thanks, you guys. I will go ahead and close us down. Thanks for those of you who stayed a little longer than we were supposed to. Next steps for the learning community this year are more online learning opportunities on those deeper level topics that I told you. I got feedback from a lot of the learning community members that said they'd like to go deeper into more system-y kind of topics. For this year's learning community. People are interested in learning more about things like the joint component and progressive engagement or alternative funding streams for rapid rehousing, and lots of other stuff. So look for the upcoming learning community newsletter for dates and times and registration information, along with other cool resources that'll help you improve rapid rehousing for youth in your community. Thanks, everybody.